This is Abe Friedtanzer from Awards Buzz, and I'm very excited to be speaking with Vincent Van Dyke about the incredible prosthetics work on the Sympathizer. How are you, Vincent?
I'm good, Abe. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Tell me all about this project. I don't even know where to start. There's so much that we all see. Where did you start with it?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting beginning. I met Robert on a different project that we were going to work on together that ended up not happening. And during our first meeting of this, we went through basically a scan process and photographs and color matching and kind of all the initial work that we would do when we start a project. And we gathered all this and yeah, we just kind of hit it off. We had a great first meeting and really kind of understood each other. And he had kind of hinted at the idea that there was another project that was in the works and that would potentially pop up, and if I was interested. And we chatted about it a little bit, and then literally, I think it was like a day or two later that we had a message on our answering machine from producers saying, hey, he wants you to do this show and dive into it. So the other project kind of fell through, and then we had all of this to basically utilize for this show, which was kind of great because we could hit the ground running. And it was a good thing because it was a tight time frame to explore this work. And so I got an initial kind of debriefing from Robert and Director Park of what the idea was, what the concept was, and what these characters would be. But nothing too crazy in depth. They were really just loose outlines. And then from there, I was able to kind of start this design process, this sculptural exploration of what these characters might look like, and then go through the notes from there.
Character you start with.
Well, it's interesting. It basically kind of started with them all at the same time. So I was kind of rotating through them. I would have um, all of the busts of Robert already created here at my studio, and they're plaster busts that are painted the same color as the clay that we use, so that everything is really nice and cohesive. It's kind of this brownish red color, and so literally, I'm just taking blobs of this oil-based clay and sculpting the characteristics and the features that I feel are right based off what I've read on paper, and kind of some of those loose conversations. I tend not to dive too deeply into script to this point, or even started to read the book. It's a little more about what feels right to me in that moment, as opposed to getting too much into the nitty gritty of story. And I like that. I like to almost kind of exclude myself from that in a sense. And so I was just rotating through them in that fashion. We photographed them, and then my thought was, because the time frame was so tight, really didn't have time to go through an approval process in a traditional manner that we would send, photos, have notes back. I would do revisions, send photos back again. This process can take weeks, if not months, to accomplish. And we just didn't have that. So basically invited everybody over to the studio, lined up these heads on a table, and had, showrunners, producers, Robert, Director Park, all present for this kind of presentation, and just said, look, throw your notes out right now live at me, and I will go through and sculpt these changes based on whatever it is that you have. And so little notes would be said, let's adjust this one's nose, or let's add a little bit more weight to the jowls on professor character. And so we just basically danced around these heads for a couple hours, and by the time they left, had approval and sign off on each one of these concepts, at least in the loose form. This is prior to any makeup tests or anything like that happening.
You look at the scripts in the book later. If so, did anything really change? Like, would have something have changed how you approached any of these?
Not really, no. I mean, it all kind of happens at the same time. So I'm diving into those things. I'm just not letting them really influence those decisions too early on. So no, I find that when we're talking about character work like this, and I'm trying to get inside of someone else's head on vision, then it's easier for me not to get clouded with my own thoughts or opinions. When I start sculpting a character like that, it often takes shape organically on its own. I mean, obviously, I'm thinking about certain things I'd like to see. For example, Professor, we knew that we were going to utilize the fact that Robert had shaved his head for that character. So we had this really wonderful bald canvas to work with, and I wanted his silhouette to feel a bit rounder, and a little bit wider. So there were little tricks that I was kind of playing with to create his nose with a bit more width, kind of these elongated earlobes, a very jowly look. He was aged a little bit. So um, these are thoughts that I have in my mind, but then as I start sculpting, they really start to kind of take shape on their own and start developing in a really, really kind of organic way.
I have a favorite from among his looks.
Well, I've mentioned him twice now. I must be partial to Professor. He's got just a characteristic about him that I really like. I also just really love what Robert brought to it. So my part of the process is purely visual at first, right? It's just kind of coming up with this silhouette of character, this loose idea of what some of this is going to feel like, and then we start to actually individually make these prosthetic pieces for makeup tests, and then we get into the finer details of things. But it's at that moment during the first makeup test where the creation comes to life. Robert actually is going to live and breathe life into this character, and we start to see it emerge in real time, which is a pretty special moment when you're a prosthetic makeup artist and designer, and you're getting into that. So watching these characters have a voice and a personality and a certain characteristics, mannerisms to them, it starts to paint a picture for me as well. And oftentimes I might go back and tweak little things about it. Professor being a great example of that, of just the way that Robert kind of held his mouth and would kind of purse his lips together in a specific way, created a little form here that I really liked. And I had jowls sculpted there, but we ended up kind of defining that a little bit more just so that it worked with that expression. And I wouldn't know that without seeing Robert bring that to life. And so all of those little pieces, when they come together, it's kind of a magical moment to see, your creation start to actually be a real thing.
Would you say that Robert is more involved typically than a lot of the actors that you work with in this process?
It varies greatly. I mean, I think sometimes there's a pretty clear line in the sand of this is the image that we're going for, and that's it. And it's not even about involvement; it's more about we're just trying to hit a mark. But because this was such an exploration, there was no design or photo of somebody saying, this is what we have to do. We have to create this on the nose. It was really just about finding characters, and I think because of that, that in and of itself is a little bit unorthodox and not something that we do often. And so I think that made it much more of a collaborative journey with Robert, so that he could really weigh in and say, well, what if this character has, this type of hair or these teeth, or what if we pad out my body a little bit in this way so that I've got some physicality to work with. So yeah, I would say that it's unique in that sense, and really, I loved it. I was so open to being able to have that type of relationship with an actor, and be able to kind of back and forth come up with these ideas and test these things, and have him really open to anything and just see what sticks.
Looking at even just some of your recent credits, I see things like The Tattooist of Auschwitz and
Mhm.
Manhunt, Gaslit, Angeline, which are all based on real people. Do you like having that as sort of a framework, or do you prefer being able to sort of design on your own?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I love the idea of being able to be a little bit more free and explore things, because I mean, I think as an artist, you always want to have the ability to do what feels satisfying and fulfilling artistically, to kind of get your own vision across. And oftentimes, if you are doing likeness work or you're doing things that need to kind of hit a mark, your hands are tied, so to speak, a bit. Now, of course, what we're always doing is kind of playing this dance, really, where you're trying to have the essence of somebody yet also try to create a likeness, and you have to land somewhere in the middle where it feels like you've hit both. And for this, because we weren't having to worry about that, I do feel like it was much more freeing, in the sense that there are no boundaries, there's no limitations here, other than making sure that we're not having Robert in the chair for 4 hours. You're kind of able to do whatever it is that you think is going to be cool and look right. So yeah, that was super fulfilling artistically for me, absolutely.
Then you have something like Fallout, which I feel like there's a lot of fan expectations of what things are going to look like. Does that keep you up at night at all or influence anything?
If I'm honest with you, it doesn't. I look, I think that it's a great question, because I think it happens a lot. And when you're working on franchises that have a history to them, where there's a fan base already established. And this is true even with a book, for example. There's a lot of things you have to kind of live up to, correct? And I try to never think about that. I mean, I think if you do, like you said, it'll keep you up at night, and you'll be worrying that you're not hitting marks and you're not making everybody happy. I think the truth of the matter is that it's impossible to make everybody happy, and that you're never going to meet the expectations or visions of every fan across the board. So with Fallout, for example, we have visual references of what the ghoul looks like in those games. But I think it's my job, and the talented sculptors and team of artists and technicians here at my studio, to come together and collectively figure out what does that mean as a prosthetic makeup, and what does that mean on Walton Goggins. You know, how do we kind of explore this so that it works on him and stays true to his physiology and anatomy, while still honoring a already established design and character. It is more difficult in some sense to try and figure that balance out and please those people. But I will tell you, I try not to let it weigh on me too much. For me, if it looks good and I'm creating something that hits the marks within me, and it feels like it resonates with me, then I hope that it resonates with a larger audience as well, and that I'm not, in a bubble feeling that.
I think that Robert being so well known and this project doing so well has given a good spotlight to this line of work. What would you like people to know about prosthetics work that they probably just either misunderstand or wouldn't have even thought of?
I think it's funny in terms of prosthetic work. I feel like the time that it takes to create prosthetics like this, and the work that goes into it in that behind the scenes essence is often lost, particularly with makeups like this. I often find that when we come to set and we have a zombie character or a real gory makeup or something like that, that it gets all the applause and oohs and ahs from everybody. And they're really impressed by that. And the truth of the matter is that those are far more easy to execute than the makeups that you see on Robert, for example. When you have really subtle, realistic prosthetic work that's on someone, there's nowhere to hide. You have to kind of execute that work at the highest level. So they're incredibly daunting tasks. You're talking about having nose prosthetics, sometimes split into two different pieces, cheek pieces that terminate in the middle of someone's face, eye bags, earlobes. These are all just floating on someone. So imagine all of those little edges being blended on a daily basis, and applied, in this case by Chris Burgoyne and Mike McCash, to exceptional prosthetic makeup artists that handled Robert's look on a daily basis. And that amount of work that goes into that, even before Robert sits in the chair. I mean, the sculpting, the molds that are made of all those individual pieces, the silicone that's cast from every one of those molds, a new set of prosthetics for every single day that a character works, because they get thrown away after a day of shooting, is another thing I feel like a lot of people don't realize. So, I like to kind of touch on that because I feel like those are really big. Those are really big elements that people, I think, maybe take for granted. They don't really realize that the efforts are actually greater on something that's more subtle than sometimes the most extravagant creature makeup that you've seen recently.
I think Grey's Anatomy is probably a good example of that.
Sorry, say that again.
I assume Grey's Anatomy is probably a good example of that, the kind of subtler work.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, especially because that's so anatomy driven. So I kind of cut my teeth on anatomy shows. I mean, Nip Tuck and Grey's Anatomy are great examples of that, where you're trying to create hyperrealism in ways where, again, there is nowhere to hide, but you're literally kind of doing procedural elements that we're watching real videos of surgeries being performed, knowing the anatomy that's going on there, how the tissue reacts, the fatty layers, the muscles. You end up having kind of a really large education on not just medicine but the human body. And so, yeah, it's a great example of not really understanding that we're not just throwing a bunch of blood on a big open gash on someone's chest and throwing a heart in a cavity. Everything is taken into consideration from that build, and the layers that go inside are quite extensive. So yeah, I think that's a great analogy.
You have so many credits just from this Emmy season alone, but is there any other prosthetic work you've seen from someone else recently on TV or in film that you think is particularly awards worthy?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, a lot, actually. I am a big fan of Barry Gower, and his team, and they do The Last of Us, and I think that work is really brilliant. And they've also been doing the last few seasons of Stranger Things. He did Game of Thrones for many seasons. And yeah, he's usually stiff competition when it comes to Emmy time, but we're good friends, and kind of razz each other about it. But yeah, I just think his work is exceptional. So he's definitely a standout for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Vincent, for talking to me and teaching everyone a little about prosthetics, and looking forward to what you work up next.
Absolutely, Abe. It's my pleasure. Thank you.